Hello, today in our Wheelbarrow Series class, we're going to talk about growing potatoes in Kentucky. The common name for potato is also white or Irish potato. Botanical name is Solanum tuberosum. They are in the nightshade family, which a lot of nightshades do have poisonous plant parts. Potato does too. The green portion is actually poisonous, so you should never eat the green parts. They are closely related to tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and even tobacco, believe it or not. And the edible portion is what we eat, is the tuber. And a tuber is actually a modified storage mechanism for plants, and it is actually a stem, believe it or not, botanically speaking. Potatoes are originally from South America. They are native to South America, specifically the Peruvian Andes. You can see, if you go down there, you can see Peru, and the Andes Mountains runs along that west coast of South America. They were cultivated along with corn, and the Incans, it was a staple of their diet, which, those are crops that are native to South America. The history and origin actually is somewhat unclear, but there are still wild potatoes today that grow in the Andes Mountains. And they're likely developed in the vicinity of Chile. If you see down there, the southern part of South America, Chile runs right down the coast there. The reason it being is where that line is where it meets Argentina is actually the Andes Mountains as well. Potatoes are a really great food source. One of the main reasons being is the tubers store extremely well, and they provide nutrition in the middle of winter and colder months whenever there's not much else to eat. They can also be cooked fresh and eaten. They can be dried or they can be frozen. And then they've also been processed into flour, starch, alcohol, believe it or not, which is vodka, and also even fed to livestock if need be. It is the fourth largest crop worldwide behind wheat, rice, and corn. Potatoes spread throughout the world pretty quickly. They were introduced to Europe by the 16th century from Spanish explorers, which took them back to Europe from South America. And because potato is a nightshade, it was slow to be accepted, just like if you've done any of the research on tomatoes, they were too, because they were considered poisonous. They're not grown as a food crop in England and Ireland until up into the mid 18th century, which, it took almost a couple hundred years for it to really become a widespread food crop from after going from South America to Europe. And they did become a major staple, particularly in Ireland, where the weather was conducive to grow them, and they provided a lot of calories in a short period of time. With the popularity of the potato in Ireland, also became the potato famine, which was caused by late blight, which is a disease that does hit a lot of the solanaceous crops. It caused serious crop failures in the mid to late 1840s, and it's one of the reasons why we have a lot of immigration from Ireland at this time coming to North America. About 1 million people died, and another million migrated. So Ireland lost a lot of people from this famine, from death, and also from actually them coming to America. Although the potato had been grown here or in Ireland since the early 1700s, they all grew the one variety of potato, and because it produced a lot, but it also was very susceptible to a particular disease, which was late blight, and when it came in, it wiped the crop out. The thing about late blight that was really bad was it rotted the tubers even after they were harvested. So people thought they had plenty of food stored, and then it just all rotted. Potatoes are rich in carbohydrates. They also have protein, calcium, niacin, and vitamin C. A large potato is about 278 calories. That's really good if you're living in an area that is short on food. But for our modern diets, it's kind of fattening for us. It does have about 26% of our dietary fiber for a day, but you do need to eat the peeling if you want to get that extra fiber. It's only 1% fat. It does provide some protein as well, about 15% of your daily needs and about 48% of your vitamin C needs. So it is very nutritious. It also has other vitamins and also has no cholesterol, and it's very high in potassium. And anybody that has really tried to keep up with your potassium, a lot of times it's very hard to get enough potassium in your day. But one large potato does provide 46% of your daily recommended dose of potassium. There's a lot of diversity in potatoes. There are over 100 types of wild potatoes that we know of. There's been widespread cultivation, which has led to numerous types and varieties developed. As you can see in this picture here, there's purples, pinks, reds, yellows, whites, a lot of different colors there. And some of those are actually also have flesh that's purple or even red. The tubers do come in all shapes and sizes and colors. There's waxy, dry, flesh potatoes, lots of variety out there. And then one good thing is that we do have these wild types still available, and we are actually taking some genes out of the primitive types and utilizing those in our commercial production to get some better disease resistance and some other desirable characteristics that we might want in our modern potato. Whenever you're selecting your potatoes to grow, you always want to purchase certified disease-free seed stock. And when you buy those, you're usually going to see a little tag on the package that will say that they've been certified to be free of disease. There's no reason to bring disease in your garden whenever we can have, or you can purchase the disease-free stock to start with. Your potatoes should also be firm and unsprouted when you purchase those. The thing about buying them locally is generally they're limited on varieties. So if you want to try some of those other varieties out there, you're probably going to have to order those. Here locally, you're usually going to end up with 3 or 4 varieties. Those varieties are usually going to be Kennebec, Pontiac, Irish Cobbler, and now Yukon Gold has been sold quite a bit locally now as well. Um, Basically, you're going to get red or white skin potatoes. Yukon Gold is more of a yellow skin potato and a little more yellow flesh. And when you do buy your seed potatoes, your larger potatoes can actually be cut into smaller pieces. Just make sure that each piece does contain 2 or more eyes. For maximum selection, you're probably going to have to go to specialty nurseries. You can find dozens of varieties by mail order. They are quite expensive to order those by mail, though. I'll let you know that up front. There's many different types of skin and flesh colors out there, which the picture earlier uh, showed you, and several different textures and flavors, believe it or not. It really is interesting when once you start growing a lot of different varieties, the different textures and flavors of each potato. They're generally going to range from mealy, which is kind of a drier potato, which is really good for, say, baking or even for mashed potatoes. And then the other ones are going to be more waxy, moist, and creamier. A lot of times they're really good roasted in the oven. They make much more of a nice flavor whenever they're roasted. The texture and taste change with maturity as well. As you know, a new potato tastes quite a bit different than the more mature potato. It's whichever one you like, but new potatoes don't store well, so usually we only get those at a particular point in the garden. One type of potato is the fingerling potato, which these have a lot of interest, especially among people that are into foods or foodies, if you want to call them that. A lot of these are used in French cooking. They are smaller potatoes with subtle differences in flavors and textures. Most of these are more of the creamier or waxier flesh potatoes, so they roast really well. They are small. They are long and narrow generally speaking, and they really do not produce a large yield. They're more of a specialty thing, so don't think that you're going to grow these and you're going to fill up your 5-gallon buckets with lots and lots of potatoes. But they are really fun to grow, fun to eat, very tasty. Probably some of the best tasting potatoes you'll find out there. Um, they're very worth trying, but don't think that you're going to get these and store them through the winter. They're just not going to produce that much for you. In Kentucky, we can get an early crop for summer use or late crop for winter storage. Believe it or not, I usually harvest my potatoes around the 1st of July, and usually I'm either out of potatoes or potatoes are starting to shrivel by, say, mid-February, but I'll go ahead and if I have any left, I'll go ahead and replant those. You can choose early and late varieties. Most of these early and late are not that big a difference, maybe a couple weeks between the harvest dates on them. The planting window, generally speaking, in Kentucky, and this is a sliding window, March 1st to April 10th. March 1st is probably a little earlier. Most of us around here are going to plant sometime in mid to late March, up until mid-April. I know last year we had a lot of late frosts and freezes that burned our potatoes back, which did reduce some of our yields. And then you can also plant what we would call a fall crop or a late planting, which would go in sometime in mid-June, mid to late June. One key thing to know that a late planting is going to be much less productive than your early planting. Um, I just usually plant one planting, and that's the spring planting, and forgo that later planting because potatoes really just don't like the hot weather in the middle of summer. If possible, you do need to avoid new garden areas that are recently in grass. I know a lot of times this is hard to do, but they do harbor grubs and wireworms is usually the problem with these because they will burrow into your potato as it's growing, and you'll end up with this dirt ring through your potato, which you'll have to cut out whenever you use your potato. So just keep that in mind. If you can avoid going into new ground, you should. Sometimes it's just not possible, and you just have to deal with the wireworm damage after. Yields can also be affected by your season, your moisture, and your nutrients. That's going to happen every year with all of our plantings of any kind of vegetable crop that we grow. And you do get the highest yields with cool weather and adequate moisture. So most of the time, we have really good spring weather for potatoes. As far as feeding your potatoes, they are heavy feeders, as you would imagine, because they are heavy yielding. A soil test is great to go ahead and do, which we preach these with every crop you grow, but it will determine your pH and your nutrient needs. Let us know if you need any phosphorus or potassium. You're going to have to go ahead and put your nitrogen in. We already know that with all crops we grow. They will grow in a wide pH range, but scab is a disease that affects the outside of the potato. It's less prevalent in acidic soils. It is a cosmetic disease, but some people don't want to see that because you're going to peel it off. It is kind of rough, so if you're one of those people that like to eat the peeling, if you have a lot of scab, you probably won't want to. So we can keep an eye on that with our pH. In addition to fertilizing, when preparing your garden, you may want to mix in additional food into your row before planting. I usually like to band some 10-10-10 or triple 19 down the row and work that in a little bit in the row and then plant into it. One thing is very important with potatoes, they do prefer a loose soil. If you have really hard clay, it will reduce your yield. So if you can do something to apply organic matter to that to loosen that soil, it's going to be great. Any kind of organic matter, potatoes will really appreciate. You can even work some leaves or anything into that, especially in the fall before you plant in the spring. That'll loosen that soil and they'll just be a lot happier. There is some debate whether this needs to be done at all. I have not seen a benefit of it, or not much of a benefit, I should say. But we're talking about pre-sprouting, or chitting is the term used for that. And that's just a process that hastens your sprouting once you put them in the ground. The overall benefit is not necessarily there, but some people like to do this. That way they'll get the seed potato to come through the ground a little faster. You can get these to chit or pre-sprout by exposing them to bright, cool conditions prior to planting. I know if you've had potatoes very long that are starting to age, they'll sprout on their own in the bag or even in wherever you store them. It doesn't impact your yield, but the only thing is you may get a little bit earlier yield. So if you want an earlier yield, you can go ahead and pre-sprout these, but it's really not something that's really necessary. When you're planting potatoes, your early potatoes should be planted about 3 to 5 inches deep. And then your later potatoes, your June planting should be 5 to 6 inches deep. That little bit of extra depth will actually do a couple things on your late planting. It'll give it a little bit cooler soils, a little bit deeper, and also will increase the chance of it having a little more moisture when we have a dry spell. You want to space your pieces or your small potatoes about 10 to 12 inches apart in the row, and then your rows need to be about 36 inches apart or wide enough that you can get down through there to get the weeds out with your tiller or however you're going to keep the weeds out. Close spacing can be used to reduce smaller potatoes if you're wanting smaller potatoes, but it also can increase your disease pressure because you'll have more foliage that won't be able to dry out as quickly if it wasn't than it would if it was spread out a little bit further. You can also plant these in just single hills, or you can plant them in a trench like we're doing here, and then you can pull the soil over that, and that makes it a lot easier to actually heal these because you can heal them in a row, and you'll know exactly where your potatoes are before they even sprout and come through the ground. As I just mentioned, healing, when your potatoes are about 6 to 8 inches in height, you do want to pull more soil up around them. That will help make sure that the developing tubers stay under the soil surface. This process can be done either with a tiller or by hand or a plow, however you want to do that. Generally, for just a home garden, usually we'll till down the row and then take a hoe and pull the soil up around the plants on each side. The procedure can be repeated a couple times during the growing season. I usually do 2 or 3, depending on how much I pull the soil up over each time. And it also will result in your deeper potatoes when you go to dig these, which is actually really good because it will keep them from being up too close to the soil surface and being exposed to higher temperatures and from being exposed to sunlight. And then that sunlight will turn the potato green, and then it is inedible after that point. Here are some creative ways that you can grow potatoes. You can see lots of people can grow potatoes in a small area in their yard. They've used old tires here, and they just kept adding tires and adding more soil inside of those as the potato grew up to keep those potatoes from being exposed to light. You can see also the top left there, there's just a bin, storage bin with soil in it, and then they'll add soil up around those potatoes as they grow up. The garbage bag at the top with the straw in it, which is similar to the straw bale gardening that we talked about earlier in the season, but this is actually just in a garbage bag instead of a bale, but they've stuffed it full of straw. That's going to need some nutrients added to that for sure because it's not going to have enough in that bag with just straw. And then down at the bottom is probably they're planted in the soil, and then they've just added a bunch of old hay around the plants as they grew to keep those tubers in the shade. Do keep in mind though that these plants do prefer cool temperatures, so don't plant them on asphalt and those kinds of things or next to something that's really hot. They just won't do as well. As with all the crops we grow, weeds are going to be an issue, and you can see how bad the weeds are in this garden here. There's a lot of germination between those rows there. They do compete for all your resources that your potatoes are looking for. Water, they'll compete for nutrients, and they're going to compete for your sun at some point because they're going to outgrow those potatoes. Potatoes are shallow rooted, so it's best not to cultivate too deeply. If you can cultivate lightly down those rows, that'll be great. A small bladed hoe works really well, especially in this soil here. It looks pretty loose. The weeds are best controlled mechanically when they're small. Don't let them get too big because if you go in and try to pull weeds out around those potatoes, you can pull potatoes up with those if you don't keep those down. One thing about this particular garden here, they could have applied some preen after planting. Preen will not bother the potatoes, even if you do it right behind planting, because this potato is growing from a tuber, not a seed. So you don't have to worry about the preen bothering those as they grow. But that preen definitely would have stopped all these small seeded weeds from germinating, and you'd had a pretty clean garden there just by one application. So we have harvesting new potatoes. New potatoes begin to form around the time of flowering. That it doesn't mean that they have to flower to form potatoes. It just means if they are flowering, they are forming potatoes. Potatoes do produce flowers. Occasionally you'll see a seed pod. Looks like maybe a little green tomato on there. The seeds are really not worth trying to plant. It would take years to get a good potato out of that. It's just much easier to go ahead and plant what we earlier said seed stock back, which are just smaller potatoes with pieces of larger potatoes cut up. You do want to dig into your hills carefully. There's no reason to dig a whole entire hill up unless you know you've got quite a bit of new potatoes there and you're not worried about losing the long-term benefits of some of the bigger potatoes. You can go ahead and dig the whole one up that way. I usually, especially really early in the season, I'll go in beside a hill with my hand and take out a few potatoes and do that on a few hills and get enough to have enough for dinner. And that way you still have your plant there producing the larger potatoes that you can actually store over a long time. So these are our mature potatoes that they've been dug, and you can see they do look like potatoes like from the grocery store, except the skins are a lot thinner because those are usually just russets, unless you're getting some of the red potatoes or the Yukon Golds. Once the vines die back naturally, it's time to harvest. You do want to allow a couple of weeks after die back for the skins of the potato to toughen up so they will store a little better because if you do it too soon, the skins are still soft and they can get scuffed up and they may rot in storage if they do. Dig from the sides to avoid damaging your tubers. Any that get cut or poked or whatever, however you dig them, if it's shelved, it may cut in two. If it's with a fork, that may be poked. Those you definitely don't want to put them in storage. Go ahead and put them off to the side. There's no reason to throw them away either, because you can take those in, wash those, cut that cut mark out, and then you can eat those. And if there's a lot of them, you could always turn those into French fries and freeze them, or a lot of other things you can do with it. But there's no reason to throw those out if they're damaged. Remove your freshly dug potatoes from the field as soon as you can. You don't want to leave them in the full sun very long, or even in bright light for a few days. They can turn them green. So it's best to get them in out of the sun and into the dark as soon as you can, just to keep them from turning green. And remember, any green portion of a potato is poisonous, so you can't eat those. And then, like you would think, handle these with care. Bruising can lead to rot, so don't knock them around too much. When you're harvesting potatoes, you can actually leave them in the ground for a short time after your vines die back. I would caution you not to do that for very long. Few reasons: weeds tend to grow back in there, and it's going to make them harder to find and to dig later. Also, your warm, dry summer conditions will keep them dormant. But as soon as we start getting a lot of rain and the weather cools up a little bit, even if we have a cool spell in, say, the end of July, 1st of August, they can start to sprout and regrow. So it's best, as soon as those vines die back, give them a couple of weeks after that, go ahead and dig them, get them out of the garden, and get them into a good storage location. For long-term storage, late potatoes store better than early crops. That would be a late crop. And I don't know that they store better. They just are harvested later, so they last longer into winter. I will tell you though, as I said earlier, I do one crop. I'll harvest those in July, and usually I'm still eating potatoes by mid-February, and that's not being stored in the basement or in the ideal location. That's being stored in a dark closet that's about room temperature. But for best storage, it's good for you to cure your potatoes for 2 weeks in a dark, high humidity area. That's going to increase your shelf life. A basement or cellar is going to be your ideal location for that. And then the optimum long-term storage is around 40 degrees. That's hard for most of us to get unless you've got a refrigerator or something dedicated to them. And it's best not to wash them until you're ready to use. It's just easier, and they'll last a lot longer if you don't do that, because by washing them, you're just increasing moisture. You got leading to the chance of bruising and damaging them. It just increases the chance of them rotting. If you're harvested when your soil is slightly moist, most soil will fall off in digging. If it's really wet, you may have to rinse them or let them. Not ideal. I would want to wait until the ground was relatively dry, though, if I were you. But even if they're a little bit moist, they will dry themselves as long as you put them in something that allows them to breathe a little bit, so to speak. If you do store them in something with plastic, make sure you don't put a top on it, because they could sweat. So your insect pest for potatoes, this is the number one insect pest. This is the Colorado potato beetle. It was very bad for years. We'll talk about it just a little more. We're also going to talk about flea beetles, leaf hoppers, and aphids. And the top two there are the ones you're going to see the most of: the Colorado potato beetle and the flea beetles. So here's your Colorado potato beetle. There on the left is the youth, or the nymphs. They're going to do most of the feeding. And then right in the middle there are the adults. They do feed a little bit, but they're not the voracious eaters as the young are there on the left. And then on the right, the picture is hard to see, but you can see the little egg masses, the little yellow egg masses on the leaves there. So what are you going to do to control these? Up until the last 10 years, they were hard to control because these have multiple generations in a season, so they become resistant to our pesticides pretty quick. But there's mechanical picking these off. We used to have to go out in the mornings and take a pan and knock and smack the leaves and get as many of them off, and then we'd pour boiling water on them. And then other options, if you want to spray them, there's a product called Colorado Potato Beetle Beater, which is a mouthful, but you can get that at the local farm stores here, and that works really well. If you use that over a couple seasons, you'll notice a drastic reduction in the amount of potato beetles you have over the long term. That is actually a product that is labeled as organic, because it is naturally occurring bacteria, or BT, in it. that only affects the Colorado potato beetle, doesn't affect anything else, so it doesn't bother other insects or us. Anytime you see those egg masses, though, go ahead and take your fingers and just pinch those and mash those. If you're squeamish about doing that, just pull that little piece of leaf off and put it on the ground and smush it with your foot. Here we have the flea beetles. You're going to see these on potatoes. They're on the left. You can see the little holes that they'll put in your potato leaves. These are going to be a problem no matter where you grow potatoes. They love potatoes. The other crop they love are eggplants. So those are the two that you're going to see these on most of the time. I rarely see the little egg mass there on the right. As you can see, a little tiny little egg mass. But if you see those, go ahead and get rid of those, pinch those out, smash those. But that picture in the middle is what they look like, but that is very blown up. They actually are the shape of a little flea, and they do hop like a flea would. So they're not hard to control as long as you're willing to use an insecticide. 7 will knock these out pretty quickly. They're easy to control. Maybe a spray once a month. I'll keep these at bay. Um, if you want to try something organic, you may have to go with an insecticidal soap or something like that. But that's going to be a lot harder to control them with that. Then we have the leaf hopper, which I don't see this very often, but you can see the mouth part of the leaf hopper basically scrapes that top layer of leaf off there and leaves that bronzing effect. These can be controlled if you have a bad outbreak, which is not very common. You could try an insecticidal soap if you want to go organic, neem oil, something like that, maybe even. Or you could go ahead and use a malathion or a 7 or something like that to knock these out. Rarely will you see a huge outbreak in our area of these. It may be a sporadic thing, but for the most part, this is not even anything that I even look for. And finally, we have aphids. If you're familiar with aphids, they can get on just about any plant that we grow. They're on the left. There's a little green aphid. They're on in the middle is the potato aphid, which is more red. Aphids come in different colors, of different types of aphids, but they all do like potatoes. And you can see the telltale sign of the aphid damage there on potatoes. You can see that kind of wimpling of the foliage there, where they've been. Usually that's from them sucking juice out of the plant. And if they do that down in the bud when the leaves are small, when the leaf grows out, you'll see that it has that kind of distorted uh, shape there. These are not that common to be a huge outbreak on potato, but it can be, especially in a season where maybe we have a little drier spring than normal. Rain usually knocks these down and keeps them at their numbers down enough that they're not really that bad most of the time on potato. But if you do need to spray, you can try an insecticidal soap because these are soft-bodied and it'll help kill them. Or you can use something else like malathion to take care of them. Um, but they're really generally not that bad a problem. But it's again, it's one of those things that 1 year they could really be really bad, and it may warrant you having to actually spray specifically for aphids. A few common diseases that we'll talk about: early and late blights, potato scab, verticillium wilt, and blackleg. This in this picture is a physiological issue, which is hollow heart. Generally, that is a potato grew too fast, and it left a hollow spot inside of the potato, and soil got in, other issues there, and you can just see it's just not a pretty sight. But usually, this is more of an instance where we had a dry spell, and then we had a lot of rain and a lot of conditions where the potato grew really fast, and it just basically left a hollow spot inside of the potato. So the two main blights are early blight and late blight. The left there, that is early blight. The middle pictures are early blight. This is the same early blight that gets on tomatoes that we have issues with every summer. Early blight is kind of another one of those hit or miss for us on potato because it is more of a warmer season blight, and our potatoes are going out by the time the weather's getting conducive for it really to take off. You will probably see it if you plant a late crop of potatoes, however. Early blight is very rampant on our tomatoes because it likes our warmer summer weather and wetter weather in the summer. The control with early blight on potato will be the same as we would recommend on tomato. It would be to make sure you get all your plant debris up out of your garden or till it under where it can break down in your soil. If you have a bad outbreak early on, you may need to spray with something like Dicanyl, which is active ingredient chlorothalonil, or maybe even mancozeb. The picture on the right there is late blight. This is the same blight that took the potatoes out in Ireland. Now it is a cool season, wet weather disease. So if we do have an outbreak on potatoes early in the season, this could be really bad. Luckily for us, though, we don't have a huge late blight problem because we have very hot summers, and the late blight doesn't really take hold for us like it does up north with the cooler summers. But if you do have a late blight outbreak, which is possible, you can see there what it does. It rots the stem, it rots the leaves. You can see the bottom picture there, the leaf. It just looks like somebody's poured oil on it, and it just rots it and just takes the whole plant away. It will also go down into the ground and kill the potatoes as well. Not something you're probably going to see here very often. If we do have late blight, usually you'll see it on tomato, and usually it's late when you find it here. It's usually around October or late September, which by then is not really a big issue for us. If you do have a late blight outbreak, it's more likely that you got it from potatoes that you purchased somewhere, or brought up another plant, a tomato, whatever, from a greenhouse that maybe was shipped from up north and planted it that had it. But it's very unusual for us to have a huge outbreak of that here in our area. As far as potato scab, you can see that is the disease we talked about earlier, which is that affects just the skin of the potato. It may reduce the storage a little bit, but you're generally not going to cause that much problem. This can be more of a problem if you have a higher pH soil, which will be something, close to 7 or even a little bit above that. So we can remedy that by lowering the pH just a little bit. But this is another one of those. You may see it some years, you may not see it all the time. But if you know you've had this every year and you want to remedy that, we may have to check your soil pH, and we may need to lower it just a bit to get rid of this disease. Then we had verticillium wilt, which is the same verticillium wilt that you can see on your tomatoes, and it's a fungal pathogen that lives in the soil. It gets into the stem, goes up the stem, and blocks the vascular flow within the plant, and it causes the top of the plant to wilt and die. You can see there the stem there is cut lengthwise, and you can see the dark streak down on each side of the stem. That's just that fungal pathogen going up into that stem and blocking the vascular flow. The only way to get around this disease, if it's in your soil, and it can be in any soil around here because it is a soil-borne disease, there's lots of weeds and other plants that can get this disease. They can hold it in your soil for a long time. If you know you had a big outbreak of this, you may make sure you plant a disease-resistant cultivar, a verticillium-resistant cultivar, or go to a different area of the garden or start a new garden somewhere else. You can also rotate out of this spot for 3 years and then come back in, as long as there wasn't plants that you planted in the area that were susceptible to verticillium wilt. So you wouldn't put peppers or eggplants or tomatoes back in this location for at least 3 years, and then you want to watch some of your solanaceous weeds as well not to do. So what would you plant there? You would plant beans, you would plant corn, squash, those kinds of things in that area for 3 consecutive years, and you can maybe come back with potatoes. This is blackleg. It is actually a bacterial disease, and it is can be soil-borne. You can see there it gets in the stem and causes it to rot. It gets into potatoes and causes it to rot. This isn't one of those diseases that's not going to be as prevalent in our area either. But just know that if you do have an outbreak of this, it's bacterial-borne. It's going to be a lot worse in wet weather. We have a wet year. It's going to be worse than in a dry year. If you know you have a spot again that's got this disease, let's rotate out of that area for a few seasons and then come back to it from something like potato that would be susceptible to that disease. There's not really much else we can do. Make sure that we plant certified disease-free stock is going to be your big key. You don't want to bring this bacteria into your garden if it's not already there. It's not that prevalent in our area. You may never see it, but I just want to put it out there that if you bring the wrong or don't have certified disease-free seed potatoes, you could bring this disease into your garden. So I know that was a lot to do with potatoes in a short period of time, but if anybody has any questions, they can always call me here at the Extension office at 859-336-7741, and happy gardening.